All right, everyone. Hello. Good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. Excuse me. I just wanted to remind everyone to please keep yourself muted and your webcams turned off to help with the speed of the connection. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Longmont Public Library's presentation of Twisted Minds, a look into the madness of serial killers. My name is Johannes Loitz, and I work upstairs in the Adult Services Department, and joining me tonight is my colleague, Devin Smith. Before we delve into the presentation itself, I want to take a moment to thank the Friends of the Longmont Library who generously support programming and other services at the library. We really couldn't do what we do without their contribution. And if you're interested in joining them and supporting the library, please visit their website at friendsofthelongmontlibrary.com. Please remember to mark your calendars for some of our upcoming programs. On June 28th, we're having both the Deep Thoughts Philosophy Reading Group and the Are You Smarter Than a Librarian Trivia Night. And on July 26th, we are welcoming Paula Stone Williams, author of As a Woman, for an author talk. So don't miss that. All right, now I'd like to introduce our presenter for the evening, Richard Estep. He is the author of 26 books, and he's a columnist for Haunted Magazine. He appears regularly on the TV shows Haunted Hospitals, Paranormal 911, Haunted Case Files, and Paranormal Night Shift, as well as appearing regularly for our programs. He lives in Longmont, and his latest book is Serial Killers, The Minds, Methods, and Mayhem of History's Most Notorious Murderers, published this past April by Visible Ink Press. You can contact Richard at www.richardestep.net. So thank you, Richard, for being here with us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Johannes, for inviting me. And just to echo your comments, a big thank you to the Friends of the Longmont Library, who are always so gracious about inviting me back to talk about the subjects that I write about. And looking at the chat list, I can see a lot of familiar names in there. So a big thank you to everybody who knows me that came out to support, and a big welcome, hello, to those of you that haven't heard me speak before or might be new to my books. I really appreciate all of you being here tonight and helping support this program. So I'm working from my own home office here in Longmont tonight. If you hear any strange jingling sounds, that is my adorable partner in crime, Lilith, my dog, who is keeping me company here in the office. Just be aware of that in case you hear strange noises. She's looking at me right now like, how dare you speak my name? I am going to get going by talking about some specific cases of serial killers, what they may have in common, how we might benefit from studying them. And some you'll have heard of before, I'm certain, and some you may not have, some may be new to you. I can tell you that it's a visual presentation, so there are quite a few photographs. There is nothing in here that is explicitly bloody and graphic and gruesome and things of that nature for the most part. I've deliberately avoided that. I'm mostly interested in what makes these individuals the way they are. And I would love to discuss that when we get to the Q&A section later on and hear what you think. But for now, let's get started and look at some of our cases. Hopefully everybody can see my screen here. Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Johannes. And that is the cover of my book, Serial Killers. The question I'm asked the most about this book is not how long did it take to write, how long did it take you to research, or anything of that nature. It's actually, is that you on the cover? And it isn't. I promise you, it absolutely isn't. But I get asked that a lot. Okay, we're going to start with the Wests, Fred and Rosemary West. One of the unusual aspects of this particular case is that they are a couple who killed. Now, serial killers, generally speaking, are solitary individuals. They do what they do as lone wolves for the most part, but sometimes they do have, I don't want to use the word assistant, but a partner in crime, quite literally. And we see this in a number of cases, such as the Moors murderers in the United Kingdom, where you tend to have a dominant partner, a dominant figure that is controlling and has the lesser personality under their thumb, under their auspices, if you will. Now, what was unusual about the Wests, and I'll go into the specifics of their case in just a moment, but what was unusual about the West is for the longest time it was believed that Frederick West, the male, was the dominant partner. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that their reign of terror over the people of Gloucestershire happened during the 1970s and 1980s. And at the time, it was believed that, the more aggressive individual of the couple was going to be the male by default. Turns out that wasn't quite the case, and that's what makes them relatively unusual and interesting to talk about. They became a national, I have to say, sensation across the United Kingdom in the late 1980s when the full extent of their crimes came to light. So Fred and Rosemary were a couple that were both, I think, deviant personalities, as all serial killers are, but deviant in a variety of ways. They had an extremely sexually dysfunctional relationship. Fred West was, it turned out, actually the weaker of the two, and the dominant personality was Rosemary. They ran a den of iniquity, we might call it, in Cromwell Street, Gloucester, where the local children, teenagers, young adults would combine. It was a place where they were freely able to watch pornography. A number of the males and some females were invited, encouraged, and sometimes forced to have sex with Rosemary West, who particularly enjoyed preying on vulnerable females. Now, as I advance to the next slide, we can see some of the West's 12 victims, and it's obvious looking at them that there's a pattern here, right? They're all females, they're all young, and the young lady in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen is actually Heather, who was their daughter. The West's pattern was that they would look for vulnerable women, offer them a place to stay at Cromwell Street, bring them in, and they would brutally assault these women, sometimes getting them intoxicated first. Sometimes they would pretend to befriend them, gain a position of trust, and then violently turn. The Wests molested their own children as well. They molested their own sons and daughters. And there became a joke in the household amongst the children that if they didn't behave, they would end up under the patio in the garden like Heather. Because Heather, bottom right again, simply disappeared one day. And there were plenty of indications of abuse at school with Heather. She would go with bruises to school, and yet nothing was ever definitively done about this. No intervention was made to avert this tragedy. She ended up being murdered and buried in the garden of Cromwell Street. All of these young ladies were buried either underneath the house, beneath the cellar, and then Fred, who was a builder by profession, although not a particularly good one, then extended the terrace of his home, the kind of concrete deck, out into the backyard and buried bodies down there as he went along. So the thought of burying one's own child underneath the patio in the back garden and then telling the other children, if you don't behave, you'll end up down there with Heather, is just absolutely dreadful. Both Fred and Rose were sexual sadists. What's interesting about Fred is that he had a characteristic that I'm noticing in quite a number of serial killers. By no means the majority, but it's quite common. He sustained a serious head injury as a younger man as he was growing up. He was never a particularly bright individual, but there is no real link between an intelligence level and someone's propensity to be a serial murder, Although Hannibal Lecter isn't real, the idea of the criminal genius isn't exactly correct. There are some serial killers with fairly high IQs and fairly low IQs. They fall all over the map, as it were. But Fred West was an aggressive young man, not particularly well educated. He had a temper, he had anger issues, and he fell actually from a fire escape, struck his head, had a severe concussion, and then fell again from the back of a motorcycle, unhelmeted, cracked his head again. And the study of serial killers shows that in several cases, the personality changes that came along with that head trauma resulted in an increased level of aggression, an increased level of risk taking. And by no means am I saying that if you take a serious hit to the head, you're going to become a serial killer. But I am saying that it may push some of those susceptible individuals a little further along the continuum to killing, to taking a life in the first place. So I found that particularly intriguing with Fred West. So all of these young ladies met a very similar profile. They were vulnerable. Some were outright kidnapped. Some were lured, but they all ended up back at 25 Cromwell Street, were tortured, sexually assaulted, and then buried beneath the house or the grounds. This is the cellar of 25 Cromwell Street before the house was demolished. The Wests actually killed 12 women at a minimum, 12 young ladies at a minimum. But Fred West killed his first wife also, and buried her in a field away from Cromwell Street. He was a trophy killer to a degree in that he retained certain bones, and she was pregnant with his child at the time of the murder. But she was the one of the few victims that did not end up underneath the house in Cromwell Street. So this is the cellar where the Wests buried most of their victims, and also committed a lot of torture here in addition to that. And Fred was almost certainly the one that buried the victims beneath the concrete in the cellar. In fact, it's entirely possible that when the Wests were caught, Rose West might actually have gotten away with it. She played a game with the authorities of saying that Fred was the dominant character. It was all his fault. She was scared of him. He was the murderous, aggressive one. And the police were initially inclined to take that seriously because it fit with the idea of the alpha male that was so prevalent at the time. But on further investigation and interviewing other witnesses, it became apparent that at least one victim had disappeared when Fred was in prison for something else, for petty crime. He was doing a stretch in jail for something minor, and victims were still disappearing, which put Rose squarely in the frame alongside him. And those that were interviewed by the police made it clear that Fred was in fact easily led, if not bullied, by his wife, who was the dominant partner of the two, and by far the more sadistic of the two. So she was the driving force behind these murders. This is a scale plan of the house at 25 Cromwell Street, and the arrows at the bottom show where the various bodies of some, but not all, of the West's victims were buried. You can see that there are at least 5 in the cellar, like so. And then as the house extends to the right of the picture, you can see that there are 1, 2, 3 young ladies buried in this area, and then Heather West furthest out on the concrete patio here. So they continued building out, they continued making modifications to the house and disposing of the bodies as they went. You can see the actual house on the left, and the media in the United Kingdom referred to it as the House of Horrors, which I think was a very apt description. By no means is this a nice looking place, but inside it was an absolute. Fred and Rose really held court in there, and if they liked you, then you were okay. If they didn't like you, then you would suffer for it. Now, when Fred and Rose West were imprisoned, Fred West escaped justice by hanging himself in his cell with a bedsheet. Initially, he was taking all of the blame for Rose, But Rose cut him off. She stopped returning his letters. She stopped speaking to him, and he became angry at this very real rejection. Uh, and quite understandably said, well, why should I cover for you if you won't even give me the time of day? And he openly admitted then that Rose West was a key component of the murders. Now, the problem is, of course, that you can't trust a word that either of them were saying. Fred West was a fantasist, a confabulist. He liked to make up stories. He told stories, in fact, that when he was growing up on a farm, he'd been badly abused by his own parents, including in one case supposedly being forced to have sexual intercourse with an animal. How much of that is true, we will never know for certain. But he was a deeply twisted individual. So was Rose. And one has to wonder what would have happened if these two had never met. If they had never gotten married, taken up residence together, would Fred West and Rosemary separately have done the things that they did? Or was it the combination of the two of them together that led to so much tragedy? There is no memorial either. So if you look at the picture on the right where you see these children walking and playing, this was 25 Cromwell Street. I know that the house on the left looks different. Things have changed significantly since then. But where you see this walkway, this alley, with the black kind of standing bollards there, this was the backyard and the house that the West lived in. And there is not even a plaque there, if you go there to this day, that tells you about those poor victims that met their end on this spot and were buried. Whether that's an attempt on the part of the people of Gloucester to bury this part, no pun intended, of their history, I don't know. But the truth is that the Wests have definitely scarred Gloucester with their activities. It's one of the things, unfortunately, that the city is most known for. So that is Fred and Rosemary West. So Fred, as I said, did take his own life before he could be imprisoned. Rose West was imprisoned. She tried to wriggle out of it. She claimed that Fred was behind it all. The jury wasn't believing it whatsoever, and has spent the remainder of her life languishing in prison, slowly going blind, in fact, losing her sight. One of Britain's most hated women, and absolutely should never have been given parole at all. So Fred and Rosemary West of the Cromwell Street House of Horrors. Coming across the Atlantic now to the United States, a fairly familiar face, the demonic-looking Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker. His reign of terror over the people of California and the Los Angeles area ran from April 1984 through August 1985, which is not a great deal of time. We're looking at 16 months, but this is the period that we know about. You know, in almost all of the cases I'm going to talk about, there may very well have been more victims, and it's important to bear that in mind. Ramirez was absolutely the product of a dysfunctional childhood, just as Fred West had been. He grew up in a fairly poor family, and his cousin Miguel, was served in the Vietnam War. Now, young Richard Ramirez idolized his cousin, and his cousin Mike taught him how he would stalk through the jungle, move silently, creep up on people. He really taught him the skills to stalk other human beings. He also showed Richard Ramirez some very graphic photographs from his time in Vietnam, including decapitated heads that he had supposedly been responsible for, severed ears and other body parts, and at least one in which Mike was holding a gun to the head of a Vietnamese female and forcing her to perform a sexual act upon him. So it's fairly easy to see, just looking at that influence during his formative years, because Ramirez was very young at the time, 6, 7, 8. It's very easy to see where he got this idea that sexual assault equated to control, and that stalking was a way to get what he wanted. So a lot of this happened during his formative years. What happened with Mike was that he got into a fierce argument with his wife and shot her dead on the spot. Richard Ramirez witnessed this. So he witnessed Mike murder his own wife. Did not say anything to the police, but Mike did go to jail. So there was also a lesson that crime will get you imprisoned. And that is something that Ramirez did not internalize. He did not take that lesson on board. This is a good overview from the Register, and I'd like to give credit to the Register for just this good outline, this timeline here. Ramirez targeted people in very interesting ways. He did not have a type. He did not have a specific, as the West did. He wasn't going after young females exclusively. He looked at opportunity. He would cruise these neighborhoods around LA County and beyond. He would always be looking for somebody vulnerable, or for a house with an open window or an unlocked door or something like that. And he would break in. If it was a single individual, he would usually cut their throat, stab them repeatedly, or as time progressed and he got more comfortable and confident, he would keep them alive, would sexually assault them, and then steal anything of perceived value in their residence before leaving. Whenever there was a couple, a male and a female, he took to carrying a pistol with him, would generally shoot the male first, because the male was obviously the greater threat, and then use slower methods and knives and things of that nature, or beating female at his leisure. So at least one victim, Carol Kyle, age 41, actually was able to endure the most horrific assault by Richard Ramirez, and he allowed her to live, which was on May the 30th in 1985. And then just the following night, he went and killed two senior citizens, two ladies aged 80 and 83, beat them to death. So it was almost random, depending on his mood, depending on his state of mind, the outcome of an attack by Richard Ramirez. And of course, because he was breaking into properties at night, he obtained this nickname, the Night Stalker, which the media absolutely loved. I know that he walked into one patient's garage. I've been too much in the medical space today. He walked into one victim's garage, shot her at close range in the head. The victim incredibly was able to bring up a hand with her car keys in it, and she survived the attack. Ramirez left her for dead, went into the house and murdered her roommate, and then fled. So he was extremely confident as time went on. Ramirez was a Satanist and believed that Satan would protect him, that his power came from the devil, and that there was absolutely nothing anybody could do to stop him so long as he was within Satan's good graces. So there was an occult element to Ramirez's murders. And we can see here that in court, he was very fond of grandstanding. Richard Ramirez liked to be feared. He liked to play up the occult aspects of his crimes. And he very much enjoyed the idea of holding the public in fear of their lives, in fear that when they went to bed at night, the Night Stalker might come for them and break into their homes. That was a key source of gratification for him. And again, he had this invulnerability complex. You know, he was absolutely going to get away with it because he was protected, right up until the night that he wasn't. I've written a book called American Hotel Story about the Cecil Hotel. You may well have seen the Cecil on this documentary on Netflix, Crime Scene, The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel. It's become a very famous location in Los Angeles, not least because of its association with Richard Ramirez. So during the murders, he was actually living on the 14th floor the uppermost floor of the hotel. Those who remembered him from those days said that he liked to sit up there smoking copious amounts of marijuana, blasting loud rock music through the hallways, through the walls of his room. And it was the kind of hotel where you really didn't go challenge somebody else if they were being too noisy, because there was a very real risk that you would end up getting stabbed or shot. The Cecil was not a nice place to stay in those days. And I bring this up because Ramirez, I think, is one of the first serial killers we can point to and say that the serial killer as rock star phenomenon he was a key part of that. And what I mean is that he had groupies turning up at his trial. He had groups of young ladies that would come to court every day, and it was almost like Beatlemania. They were fans that would holler and shriek and "I love you, Richard" and all that kind of stuff, which just is beyond belief when you look at the fact that his crimes were so heinous, that he inflicted the most appalling sexual brutality upon his female victims. The idea that he should have a female fan base was shocking, and yet it absolutely was true. He was ultimately convicted of 13 murders, and it's believed that there were more. Certainly his first murder, which was not known about at the time, was in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. He killed a 9-year-old girl in a basement, hanged her just a few inches above the ground. And it was not known at the time that this was one of Richard Ramirez's victims. So there are almost certainly others that we don't know about. And Ramirez has kind of descended into legend and myth in many ways. There are stories, for example, that he was seen dumping his bloody clothes in the dumpsters behind the Hotel Cecil after the murders, and then would climb the stairs to the 14th floor, semi-naked, covered in blood, to get to his room, which is a chilling image, and it makes for a great story, and yet nobody's entirely sure where it originates from or who these eyewitnesses are that claim to have seen it. So he's already starting to become a part of popular culture. His connection with the Cecil was kind of capitalized on by the very popular show American Horror Story Hotel, my bad, in which the spirit of the serial killer is associated with this hotel, which is absolutely based on the Hotel Cecil. And Ramirez in the show, you can see firstly, they cast a fairly handsome actor in the role. It does look a bit like Ramirez, but you've got the leather jacket, you've got the shades. He kind of was serial killer chic, serial killer cool. And this is a relatively new phenomenon, and a lot of it does begin with Ramirez. The idea that we start to, or some aspects of our culture, actually idolize these individuals. You can now buy T-shirts with Richard Ramirez's face on them, which is almost impossible to comprehend, you know? And yet almost nobody can tell you the names of any of his victims. Those are the people we really should be remembering. So it's an interesting and I think sad commentary on the way that Western culture and society works, that this fascination with serial killers, especially certain ones, has kind of spilled over into the popular mainstream, and that they now have a fan base. In the media, there was this pretty interesting movie starring Richard Jordan about the hunt for Richard Ramirez. And Netflix has its own documentary called Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer, which, again, they make this man look cool. You know, considering what he did, it's hard to believe. But we are fascinated with him and the likes of him. And he had that James Dean image of live fast, die young, leave a good-looking corpse, as the old saying went. Ramirez actually died on death row of cancer before the lengthy appeal system could be completed and before he could be executed. He was caught actually because a young man, a teenager, noticed him driving through the neighborhood, trolling for victims, recognized the very saturnine, sallow, greasy-haired look of Ramirez, and was able to report part of his license plate and some other identifying information to the police. They were able to find the car, to track it back to Richard Ramirez. They put out a wanted all points bulletin, and Ramirez's picture went on the front page of all of the newspapers in California. Ramirez walked into a convenience store in the summer of 1985 and saw his own face staring back at him from all the newspapers. Went outside into the street trying to get away, and a crowd recognized him. You can see this on the cover of the DVD on the left. A crowd of people recognized him, and they beat him pretty significantly before the LAPD ironically arrived to save him. There's a very good chance that the people in the neighborhood that recognized Ramirez, a guy that held them in an absolute state of terror and panic for well over a year, would have beaten him to death or strung him up from the nearest lamppost if the police had not intervened. So it seems as if Satan was sleeping on the job that day. So that is Richard Ramirez, and he is absolutely an iconic serial killer. One of the most prolific serial killers we have out there was Dr. Harold Shipman, who, we've gone from a man that looks like this to somebody who could be your accountant, your bank manager, your doctor, as indeed Harold Shipman was. He absolutely looked like that kindly uncle or grandfather, a professional physician who murdered well over 200 people. In fact, to this day, nobody is entirely sure how many victims Harold Shipman claimed. He was a doctor in the United Kingdom, and as a young man, Harold Shipman's mother had been dying of a terminal illness that was very painful, and physicians made house calls in those days. And so the local GP, the general practitioner, would come to the Shipman household, would come to Mrs. Shipman's bedside, and would administer doses of morphine and other opiates to help address the severe chronic pain that she was in. So we know that seeing the doctor come in and take his mother's pain away was a large component, a large motive force for Harold Shipman to go to medical school and become a doctor himself. And had he not been such a pathologic personality, that would be a wonderful part of a life story, wouldn't it? A man who watches a doctor do good goes to become a doctor himself and do good. But instead, Harold Shipman had some, shall we say, broken wiring. Underneath the surface, the jovial, collegial, friendly surface, there was a deeply disturbed and twisted individual. So the British newspapers described him as Britain's worst serial killer, certainly in terms of numbers. There are 15 confirmed victims, almost certainly more than 200. The number 250 has been used a lot. Coroner said it could be as many as 1,000. So it is absolutely beyond belief. This is not a man who used violence. And part of the reason for which Shipman was able to get away with his murders is that in the United Kingdom, as here in the United States, the doctor, the physician, is one of the most trusted and trustworthy members of society. Working in a small community, Shipman was well known by his patients, and he was very well liked. What's interesting is that when you look at the people who worked with him, fellow doctors, his peers, those who were on the same level as him, said that, he could be difficult sometimes, but generally not too bad. But if he saw you as being beneath him, if you were, say, a secretary or a records clerk, or were not the professional that he was, he looked down on you and treated you quite badly. There are many records of Shipman being difficult, if not outright obnoxious to those who were under his authority, but not generally his patients. It was almost as if he cultivated this image of the perfect, friendly GP. what was happening was Shipman was going to his patients and administering fatal doses of diamorphone hydrochloride, which is essentially medical grade heroin. He would administer large doses. The way this drug kills you is it stops your breathing, knocks down your respiratory drive. So when given therapeutically in appropriate doses, it is a wonderful medication that can help offset serious and severe pain. Harold Shipman was going through this like water, not least because he was an addict himself. As a fairly young doctor, he became addicted to several different types of painkillers and began writing himself false prescriptions for them. This was ultimately discovered, and he was able to transfer to a new location rather than having his medical license revoked. Shipman was at a new practice, and it was found out that, again, he was diverting, is the term, controlled substances like this for his own benefit. And he tried to blackmail the partners into further enabling him. He said, look, this is a scandal you guys don't want, and you're just going to turn a blind eye to this. In fact, maybe you should help me, and nobody need be the wiser. The sheer arrogance of that is incredible. There was no remorse, no regret, no humility in Harold Shipman whatsoever. Now, to their credit, the partners of the medical practice turned him in. They did report this abuse. It is a crime. Shipman pleaded all kinds of personal problems. There was some crocodile tears, the equivalent thereof. And rather than having his medical license revoked again, was given some time in rehab, was allowed to get treatment rather than punitive actions taken against him. And Shipman was allowed to go on being a physician somewhere else. So there is this whole issue of a problem doctor being allowed to transfer from place to place and start with a clean slate. And this ultimately led to the deaths of hundreds of his patients. These are just a few of those patients. And again, you can see there is a definite commonality here, can't you? These are all senior citizens. Now, to be clear, not all of Shipman's victims were females, but he was particularly good at ingratiating himself with these ladies. I think they felt a little bit maternal towards him, and he would dial up the charm. He would go to their home, and just as he'd seen done to his own mother, would deliver fatal overdoses of opiates. And the village and the locals loved Shipman. They thought he was a wonderful man, a wonderful doctor. But his patients were dying off in increasingly great numbers. And he was going through a significant number of controlled medications. And it was a long, long time before anybody started asking serious questions. Excuse me. Now, on the left, you can see a death certificate of a patient that was certified by Harold Shipman. The cause of death was supposedly a cerebrovascular accident, which is a stroke. A hypertension would imply that because the patient had high blood pressure, they had a brain bleed, essentially a blood vessel in their brain ruptured and caused a hemorrhagic stroke. And that one of the causal factors here was diabetes. Now, uncontrolled diabetes does indeed contribute to death by stroke, certainly. But Shipman got sloppier and sloppier with his causes of death and was essentially putting down old age on many of his death certificates, just old age. And finally, questions were asked about why so many of Harold Shipman's patients were dying of old age, far beyond what one would expect the normal numbers to be. And then he would have the gall to send out these sympathy cards to the families of patients that he had killed. Now, how was Harold Shipman caught? Well, another commonality with serial killers is they usually begin as cautious individuals. No matter how pathologic your personality may be, taking a human life is rarely something that is done lightly at first. So they tend to be somewhat hesitant. in the beginning. They tend to try very hard to cover their tracks, to make sure there are no witnesses, no evidence, that nothing points back to them. And invariably, they get away with it. And they find that they like it. So they do it again. And they're still cautious. And they do it again and again. And this may take place over months or years. Shipman, we know, was killing patients between 1975 and 1998 is the most likely time frame. So we're looking at 23, maybe 25 years, if not longer. People get sloppy over that length of time, no matter what they're doing. And that's exactly what happens with many serial killers. It's not usually the fact that they have bad luck, which gets them caught. It's the fact that they got complacent, they got arrogant, and they thought, I've done it before, I can do it again, I will get away with it. Which is true right up until the moment when it isn't. So Shipman is sending increasing numbers of deceased patients to be either autopsied, or if there was no autopsy, or inquest as they call it in Britain, then they would simply be buried. And he made the mistake, this is the actual document here, one of his patients, Kathleen Grundy, Shipman forged her last will and testament. And in case it's not easy to see, here's a direct quote. Looking at the gifts and legacies section, which is in the middle of the screen, I leave all my estate, money, and house to my doctor. My family are not in need, and I want to reward him for all the care he has given to me and the people of Hyde. He is sensible enough to handle any problems this may give him. My doctor is Dr. H.F. Shipman, 21 Market Street, Hyde, Cheshire. Now, anybody looking at this is probably going to smell a rat. This patient's daughter, Mrs. Grundy's daughter, not only found this suspicious that her mom had suddenly changed her will very shortly before her death, but she had some legal expertise and knew that this was not right. There was something wrong with this document. And this attempt to get his patient's money, house, and estate, which Shipman didn't need. It's not like as a doctor he was short of money. But this was what really started unraveling his whole house of cards and led to his arrest and investigation. Notice also that funeral wishes, the patient said she wanted her body cremated, which was preferable for somebody like Shipman, because of course you can't go back if there are any questions and examine cremated human remains. So he thought he was very clever. What he did was shoot himself in the foot here. If he hadn't tried to benefit monetarily, it's entirely possible that he would have kept on murdering his patients. May have killed hundreds more. It's entirely possible. So on such small things as a forged document, do momentous events turn sometimes? And we have to ask why. You know, this wasn't a man like Richard Ramirez that gained sexual gratification from killing. He wasn't assaulting his patients. He wasn't abusing them physically. Shipman had a God complex. He got off on having the power of life and death over his patients. He really enjoyed the fact that he could come into your bedroom and you might have a fairly minor complaint, such as a headache or a racing heart rate or one of 100 things. And he could give you an armful of opioids and he could walk out having taken your life and he could get away with it. So this is the ultimate perversion of the medical practice. Shipman went from seeing pain medication as being a very beneficial thing to do for a patient to using it to murder them. Now, the only real benefit, and I probably shouldn't say that, but I'm sure you know what I mean, to what Shipman did is that when it was finally uncovered, the UK did tighten up its laws regarding controlled substance tracking, monitoring where these vast quantities of potentially lethal drugs were going, how much was being prescribed by a physician. And they also tightened up the way in which inquests or autopsies were regarded. So there were some direct changes to the law as a consequence of the Shipman murders. Again, much like Fred West, he eluded justice because he hanged himself in his cell before the completion of his trial. This is a letter that Shipman wrote when he was in jail, and he knew his mail was being read, but he says, no one saw me do anything. As for stealing morphine off the terminally ill, which he did, he took his patient's drugs. Again, no one saw me do it. So it's worth noting he's not saying, I didn't do this, I'm an innocent man, I'm not guilty, I've been falsely accused. He's saying, nobody saw me, nobody saw me. You can't prove it. Which speaks a lot about his mindset. He was a very arrogant, narcissistic, and sly individual. So he was found hanging in his cell before his trial could be completed. And the number, I know it's very difficult to read here, so I'll read it for you. He was jailed for killing 15 for certain. The number, which was initially at least 100, is now quoted on the day of his death as being 215. And there is, I quote, real suspicion over another 45. But there's the entire possibility Shipman could actually have killed 1,000 patients. It's staggering, absolutely staggering. So Harold Shipman, Britain's Dr. Death. The Zodiac Killer, popularized by David Fincher's film about the hunt for the Zodiac. One of the things that fascinates us so much about this particular murderer is, to this day, we do not know who he was, why he killed, or anything about him. Now, this is something that the Zodiac shares with Jack the Ripper, who, again, we have this permanent fascination with, because there are at least 100 possible suspects identified for Jack the Ripper. But we will never know, despite the fact that several authors have gone out there and said they have definitively solved the Ripper case. To this day, we do not know the identity of Jack the Ripper. And the same is true of the Zodiac. Now, the Zodiac killed his patients during the victims during the 1960s and 1970s. It's believed he killed more than the 6 that we know he killed. He claimed 37, but we have the Zodiac for sure on 6, with 1 attempted. What he very much liked to do was taunt the police, and this is something we see commonly with serial killers. They enjoy the fact that the police are on their trail, but they are always 1 or 2 steps ahead of them. So the Zodiac, and you can see the crosshair logo at the bottom, became kind of the Zodiac symbol. The Zodiac would start out by approaching couples in Lover's Lane. They were parked on a date, maybe making out. He would drive up to their car, shine his headlights into the car to blind them, and then would open fire on them from close range. Those are the first Zodiac murders that we know about. But he would go on to kill others with knives as well. And sometimes he would bind the victims and he would string things out a little bit. But the letters we know were genuine because the police always hold something back in order to weed out the various crank communications and copycats that always crop up when something like this happens. The author of this particular letter knew things about the crime scene that you could only have known if you had been there. And it's also worth pointing out that you can see the spelling of Christmas there is poorly spelled. Spelling mistakes were fairly indicative of Zodiac letters as well. So here we see another one. After the murder of one of his victims in a taxi cab by shooting, he sent a blood-stained piece of the victim's shirt in. So a lot of these crimes are linked by documentation, but the Zodiac sent in code ciphers, which were extremely difficult to break. So here are 6 of his victims on the left, 6 that died, and Brian Hartnell on the right, was stabbed 8 times in the back, but survived. And incredibly, if you watch the movie Zodiac, directed by David Fincher, he actually has a cameo in that movie as in the background during one of the scenes. So this haunted Mr. Hartnell for decades after he became one of the Zodiac victims, but he did survive. The others were killed. This is a photo, a drawing, not a photo fit, of what the Zodiac was believed to look like. And of course, there is nothing distinctive really about this person's face. There are a couple of slight changes made, but we can see this looks like almost any 20 to 30-year-old male that you might care to name. In one of the murders, the Zodiac wore a hood to hide his face. He never liked to let his face be revealed. This was drawn on the side of a car door during one of the murders. Vallejo, which of course is the location of one of the murders, he gives dates right here, gives a time, and then by knife indicates that the murder was carried out by knife, not by gun, when the Zodiac killer changed his MO, his modus operandi, or method of committing murders. So the ciphers that the Zodiac left, one of them was just cracked. Bear in mind that this goes back to the 1960s. Some of the finest minds in the world, including the US intelligence community, the NSA, the CIA, people who crack codes for a living, people whose job it is to read the mail, if you will, the encrypted communications of our enemies and sometimes allies on the international stage, were all turning their attention to these ciphers and were unable to crack them. And then a team of private individuals cracked what's called the 340 cipher, or the Z340 cipher, on December the 3rd of this year. So these were essentially amateurs, not working for any law enforcement organization. And it's called the 340 cipher because that's the number of characters there are in it. Zodiac ciphers are titled Z, and then whatever number equates to the number of characters in the cipher. And the message read, I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show. There was somebody that called in to a TV show after the time of murders, claimed to be the Zodiac, said that he needed to be stopped before he killed again. And it was believed that this could possibly be the actual killer. Well, this Zodiac cipher says that it was not him. The person who called in said that he was afraid that he would be executed in a gas chamber. Well, the cipher says, this brings up a point about me. I'm not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner. Note the misspelling of paradise. There is a C instead of an S, because I now have enough slaves to work for me, where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise. So they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise, death. So there's a lot of nonsense in there, but there are enough nuggets that imply strongly this was an actual Zodiac communication. The FBI did validate this and say, yep, we do believe this is genuine. So the case is still open. What we do not know who the Zodiac was. And for many years after the murders, during the 1970s, 1980s, even 1990s, people would wonder, is the Zodiac in a retirement home, a nursing home? Did the Zodiac die? Did the Zodiac go to prison for something else? Because serial killers rarely just stop. They don't. They tend to kill and continue to kill, often over a series of decades, and sometimes with fairly lengthy gaps. Gaps can take years, but they usually do not stop once they've started, for the most part. So why did the Zodiac stop killing? Well, there are a number of other murders that are linked to Zodiac, or believed to possibly have been laid at this killer's door, but the law enforcement is not 100% certain of any of them beyond his original 7 victims. So why would he stop? The same question again is asked about Jack the Ripper who suddenly stopped killing. And it's been theorized that Jack the Ripper went to the United States or went overseas, that he died of something else, that he may have gone to jail for something else also, because criminal behavior with serial killers does not just stop at murder. Often they will be thieves, they will be violent, they will get into fights, they will turn their nose up at all of the rules of society that the rest of us live by. So some of them go to jail for assault or domestic violence or a number of other things. But for whatever reason, the Zodiac just stopped. And there are 2 ciphers remaining uncracked. Z13 on the left. This is the Zodiac speaking, by the way. Have you cracked the last cipher I sent you? My name is 13 characters. Almost certainly this is not going to be broken. And the police believe that the Zodiac would never give his actual name anyway. This is probably just a waste of time, a red herring, a method of taunting them. They don't believe that this would actually reveal the name of the Zodiac, but we'll only know if the cipher is ever broken. And Z32, which says, you'll notice Zodiac 12, SFPD 0, 12 being, what, right? Are we talking about 12 victims or something else? The map coupled with this code will tell you where the bomb is set. You have until next fall to dig it up. He claimed to have planted a bomb at a specific location, and this cipher was intended to be used with a map. Well, no bomb went off that we're aware of, and we still don't know what these 32 characters mean, whether they will be latitude and longitude coordinates or the name of a location. But unless these 2 remaining ciphers are cracked, although people have come along and they've claimed to know the identity of the Zodiac killer, the truth is we are likely never going to find out who this was. Our final serial killers are historical in nature. So we are going back to Scotland in the late 1820s to meet a couple of gentlemen called William Burke and William Hare, who you can see right there. Burke and Hare have become famous for their crimes, and what's interesting is that over the years they've become almost beloved, especially in Scotland. The Resurrection Man is a phenomenon that you can see based on this contemporary drawing on the left. The birth of anatomy was occurring in the early 19th century. We were starting to see medical schools truly begin to dissect cadavers to learn about the way the human body was structured, the performance of the organs, the way things were laid out, what they looked like when they were diseased. So medical training for doctors involved dissection of cadavers, and cadavers were at a premium. So the Resurrection Men were, you can see groups of men like this who would go to cemeteries at night, and they would dig up the graves of the recently deceased, because the fresher the body, the more money you would get for it. And they would sell it to the medical schools and colleges, and no questions would be asked about where the body was obtained from. And people became so afraid of the Resurrection Men that you can see on the right here, they would have iron cages and various foiling methods placed over their graves to prevent them from being dug up and sold. Remember that there was a very strong belief in those days that you needed your body to be intact on the day of judgment so that you could, when the final trumpets blew, you could be resurrected. Hence the term kind of Resurrection Men. People were terrified of having their bodies cut up on a table in a medical school. So families got together and they paid for night watchmen to stand guard in cemeteries, special watchtowers, some of which still stand. And quite often the Resurrection Men would just cut these watchmen in, and they would plead ignorance as to how graves had been opened in the night. So this was a phenomenon in the United States as well as in Great Britain. The idea that recently deceased bodies had value on the market. So where most serial killers we've talked about today killed because of a sick, twisted compulsion, Burke and Hare were businessmen. They were trying to make a buck. That's why they killed. They started out digging up bodies, of course, and when the bodies were in short supply, they hit upon the idea, well, if there are no fresh bodies to be had, maybe we could make some ourselves. So the technique they developed was called Burking, and this is a term that is still used today in legal practice if you look this up. And what it meant was that if possible, you got your intended victim drunk first, so they would struggle less, but that wasn't mandatory. You would sit on the chest, so applying a heavy weight, preferably a couple of knees on the chest to make it harder to breathe. Put a hand over the victim's nose and mouth and push the jaw up and closed. Okay, so it was almost impossible for them to breathe. And you would hold it there until they went into respiratory arrest, then cardiac arrest, and then they were dead. And the big benefit of the technique of Burking was that there were no awkward signs that you had to explain away. There were no gunshot wounds or stab wounds or lacerations, very few signs of blunt trauma or penetrating trauma to explain when you sold this fresh corpse to Dr. Knox or one of the other medical school overseers that were paying good cash. The equivalent of about $1,000 in today's money was what they would get for each of these murders. So not a lot, but the more pristine the corpse, the better the payout was going to be. And some of the doctors were more than willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that there were suspicious circumstances surrounding their newest acquisitions. So Burke and Hare were ultimately caught, not until they killed, it's believed, 16 victims. Now, Hare actually testified against Burke at his trial. And what happened was that Burke was sentenced to be hanged, and his execution was the kind of public event of the decade. They had tens of thousands of people thronging the streets. This was the equivalent of Super Bowl Sunday for them, watching William Burke go be hanged. So once he was hanged and the crowds had gone away, they took his body and they dissected it. Burke was terrified of being subjected to the same things he'd subjected his victims to. So it was kind of poetic justice, if you will. His body was dissected as part of a medical school lecture. And today, you can see in the School of Medicine in, I believe, Edinburgh, the life mask of William Hare on the left and the death mask of William Burke before he was dissected. So we can actually see Burke and Hare's faces. Burke is still around and is teaching people because his skeleton is on display in the Anatomy Museum at the Edinburgh Medical School. So they keep him in a glass case for as long as there's going to be a school in order to serve as a warning and to educate countless medical students down through the decades on how the human skeleton is put together. What happened to William Hare? Well, he was let off because all of the blame went with Burke, effectively. He had to get out of town before the mob could get him because the mob wanted him. They wanted his blood. So he snuck out of town and ended up crossing the border, sneaking across the border from Scotland into England. And there he disappears from the pages of the history books. So we are not sure what happened to him. But William Burke's fate is well known. Now, in popular culture, it's interesting. From 1960 through 1972 through 2010, Peter Cushing appeared in a horror movie with Donald Pleasance called The Flesh and the Fiends, which was about Burke and Hare. Murder was their business. And this was a very dark, very creepy kind of gothic movie. During the 1970s, we saw a lot more in the way of exploitation films. So the Burke and Hare story was told again. But in 2010, John Landis directed Burke and Hare, and they were turned into essentially a couple of cheeky characters. You were asked to root for them. So they were no longer the bad guys. They were a couple of cheeky chaps that were just trying to make ends meet in the only way they knew how. And they turned the story of these 16 murders into a comedy starring Simon Pegg and Andy Serkis as Burke and Hare. So it just goes to show how their impact on culture has changed over the years. So Burke and Hare, The Resurrection Men. So we've covered 5 sets of serial killers, and that concludes the presentation. I would love to open this up to a Q&A if we're able to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Gosh, that's so interesting. We do have just a few questions. We're almost about 10 minutes over time, so we'll probably get to these quickly.
Sorry for that.
No, that's okay. Our first question comes from Luke. He asks, do you own any interesting relics from locations visited in the past?
You know, I do have my own skeleton. But unlike Mr. Burke and Mr. Hare, I came by this one honestly. I'm a clinical educator by profession. He is not a real human skeleton. He's just an educational model. And I've used that to teach my students over the years. But when it comes to some of the criminal locations I visited, I do not tend to keep trinkets and stuff like that. I try and be respectful of those places and the things that have gone on there. And honestly, doing the research for this book on serial killers was not always a pleasant experience, and I kind of wanted to wash it out of my brain. Now I'm working on a second volume to follow it up because the first book did relatively well, and so I'm going back into that research mode again. Fortunately, I have friends that are very interested in this, like my friend India Hopwood, who helps kind of as a consultant to suggest cases and things of that nature. But I am not a collector of these kind of things, no.
Okay, great, thanks. So that kind of goes into the next question. It was actually from Johannes. He wanted to know, mentally, psychologically, how do you feel with being so saturated with all the evil and brutality as you research this subject? How do you bring yourself back from all that and stay balanced?
Well, it helps being a paramedic in that I'm able to keep some kind of professional separation between work and home. Not to go into any details at all, but I've worked on a number of very distressing, very disturbing medical and trauma cases over the course of my career, most recently the mass shooting in Boulder. And if you don't develop certain calluses, if you don't develop an ability to divorce yourself from those feelings, it will definitely take a toll on you, and it will take a toll on you anyway, but you can somewhat minimize it. So I am a voracious reader and a voracious escapist. I love science fiction, so speaking to librarians and readers, I like the works of Robert Heinlein, Terry Pratchett, Andy Weir, people like that. That's how I deal. That's how I cope.
Great, great. All right, we have just a few more from Tammy. Are you aware of any hauntings related to serial murderers, various locations, murder sites, their homes? I can answer this for you. Yes, absolutely, you do.
No such thing as ghosts, Tammy. I don't know what you would believe such things. So I've worked on several cases. Fox Hollow Farm in Indiana. I wrote a book about that. The John Wayne Gacy case, I wrote a book about that, and I'm back investigating that haunting next month, in fact, in near Springfield, Illinois, a small town near there where Gacy was known to run a fast food franchise, in fact. And also the Villisca Axe murders. I wrote a book about that and investigated those. So yeah, there does seem to be a Venn diagram almost where serial murder and paranormal claims meet.
Yeah. Those axe murders, that was an interesting story. I remember when you came and talked to us about that.
And most people don't realize, but there was a series of those axe murders down in Colorado Springs, fairly close to us, that are believed to have been attributed to the same killer, the Villisca killer.
Oh, yikes. Wow. All right, we've got one more question from Linda. Do you think the Zodiac killer may be identified through DNA?
So that's the hope, isn't it? That the one constant with these cold cases is that science marches on. So as long as evidence has been saved and not contaminated, perhaps we'll reach a point in the future at some time when our science and our ability to cross-match will solve these cases. It does happen, and it happens with increasing frequency these days. So I don't think we'll stumble upon a fact. I think, yes, DNA will solve these cases if anything does.
Wasn't the Golden State Killer caught because of ancestry or something?
Yeah, and the same thing has been done with the Boston Strangler, who I also wrote about in the book.
Oh.
There was a lot of debate as to whether Albert DeSalvo really was the Boston Strangler. So we do see DNA all the time is adding to this. And I'm investigating a case in Colorado now. I can't name the location, but it is a serial killer cold case with a paranormal aspect, where we have hopes that that may play a role in conclusively proving guilt or innocence.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, thank you, Richard. Johannes, I'll let you wrap up your program. Always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Always an interesting talk. Yeah.
Kevin, you just wrapped it up for me. Thank you so much, Richard, for coming out. Really appreciated it. I was engrossed. So when your second volume comes out, I'd love to have you back. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate you being here. Everybody be safe. Thank you, Devin, and have a great night.
Take care, everyone. Thank you for supporting me, and support your local library. They're awesome.